Hi, everyone. Welcome to this, what I hope would be a usefully insightful session for all of you. We have an excellent panel today. We'll actually start off with a quick round of introductions. I'll kick off myself. My name is Raghu Dharmaraju. I'm the president of Art Park, or AI and Robotics Technology Park at IISc. It's a fairly unique nonprofit formed with the mission of propelling deep tech innovation at the intersection of research and academia, startups and venture capital, and governments and nonprofits. Previously, I had built a portfolio of AI-based innovations as a founding leader at Vadhwani AI, the Vadhwani Center for Artificial Intelligence, and spent a lifetime generally trying to bridge innovation and impact, right? With that, let me just take a minute or two really setting some context before I turn it over to my panelists here. But before I do that, maybe I should quickly introduce the panel. We have Dolly Agarwal, who is part of the technology team at Pratham Education Foundation, Professor Jasjeet Singh of INSEAD. We have Akanksha Sharma of Sterlite Technologies. We have Gaurav Sharma of GIZ India. He's a lead advisor on artificial intelligence there. And Subhashish Bhadra of Omidyar Network, India. So we have a wonderful panel today, and I'm going to, in no particular order, only the order in which I see you all on my screen. And Gaurav, by the way, I can't see you on the screen. It'd be great if you could. Gaurav, I'm actually seeing you twice. Maybe that's why I'm confused. Okay. So what I'll do is maybe perhaps start with Professor Jasjeet Singh and request everyone to introduce themselves briefly, but also touch on data and AI relevant work they have been doing recently.
Thank you very much, Raghu. Hello, everyone. My name is Jasjeet Singh. I'm a professor of strategy here at INSEAD, which is a business school. I'm based in the Singapore campus, focused on issues related to sustainable development and social impact more broadly. I'm not just, I'm a bit of an outsider, not quite just an AI person. But in my research, like most academics, I do a lot of empirical research, which relies a lot on data analytics, but more through a hypothesis testing lens that employs more traditional statistical or experimental methods rather than AI machine learning, because as you probably know, academics are usually more interested in developing, understanding causal relationships and hypothesis testing, and AI and machine learning are much better at data mining with the prediction view or pattern view rather than causal estimation. On the teaching side, my big focus is guiding people more towards making sure they're actually having impact and thinking about it rigorously rather than just relying on their intuition and good intention. So this means being very clear on problem definition, goal setting, having a strategy, and then having an appropriate impact management process. So in that context, for me, including AI and machine learning in discussion of how technology plays a role in impact. I mean, that's the big focus. And I think of technology ultimately as a tool that's going to shape the nature and extent of impact. So that's my interest in all technology, including obviously AI. Because for me, it doesn't matter how cool or fashionable everybody thinks the technology is. It's ultimately about the desired impact and the cost effectiveness of realizing it. And importantly, the big focus, and I think this is in line with some of the themes today, should be on net impact, which is looking at different approaches and technologies and picking one where the net impact in terms of the realized impact, as well as adjusted for the unintended negative consequences, I think that has to be maximized. So having said that, I really, again, would like to thank the organizers for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be a part of this amazing panel, which has people I know working on the cutting edge of technology, especially AI, and are certainly much more knowledgeable about the specifics of that. So I really look forward to the discussion and learning from all of you. So thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Jasjeet. Let me now turn to Gaurav, Gaurav Sharma of GIZ. Gaurav, as a funding organization and convener of the ecosystem, would love to hear your thoughts, and obviously, please introduce yourself and touch on recent work on data and AI.
Yeah, thank you, Raghu. I'm part of German Development Corporation, and we do both bilateral projects with India and global projects. My project is called Fair Forward AI for All, which which actually syncs well with the theme AI for social good, because we have a benchmark to really make AI accessible to the masses in countries. So we work with 5 countries in Africa, and 1 is India. And our sort of 3 objectives or pillars are to support the local AI innovation ecosystem, to look at opportunities at opening data sets within AI in India, which could be used, and even from data collection to data synthesis, and where it could really help enhance the load work, because data itself, good quality AI subscribed data set takes like 90% of the total time to get generated. And the last part is on policy frameworks in India, where we could support both at the policy strategic level and the practitioners level of how even developers who are working AI and ML engineers to look at the idea of transparency, bias, accountability, explainability, all those other ethics and AI factors in India. So these are the 3 big streams we are looking at. At a substantial level, we are working on speech synthesis with creation of data sets for languages in India, which rolls up into the National Language Translation Mission of the Government of India. And on the second level is also on the machine learning for Earth observation, where we're trying to create capacities in making technologists sit with domain experts, and this is still in pipelines, to see where, how, basically how startups should look at larger picture, not only looking at particular ROI based investments in AI. So there is if you explain the ecosystem in much detail, what are the government looking for, and where the solutions are required, there could be much larger capacity. And in this sense, Raghu, we are also talks with the National Institute of Advanced Studies in Bangalore to work with certain capacity generation. And in this format, we might like to invite also people from Northeast ecosystem, and which are a little more digitally not as advanced in terms of emerging technologies. I'll rest it at that, but we have a larger outlook, and AI and climate change is something which we are also looking at now, trying to work with at least the initial talks have started with Niti Aayog to substantiate some part of it, because India's climate-based output is in relevance to emerging technologies is still very nascent. People are not thinking about it. So that I would rest at that. Thank you.
Got it. Thank you, Gaurav. I see Akanksha has joined us. Hi, Akanksha.
Hi, Raghu, and hello, everyone. Thank you for coming and joining this forum.
Yeah, and perhaps Akanksha, you could introduce yourself and touch on data and AI relevant,
Sure.
agenda and work that you have.
Sure. So I lead the global ESG portfolio along with policy at Stellar Technologies. And STL is an integrated data network innovators, and we are trying to bridge the digital divide gap in India and outside as well. So one of the very interesting things that we tried to do, and Arthan played a huge role in putting it together, was to look at different aspects of how data and AI can be an enabler in the development sector. And few things I would like to briefly touch upon, and as the discussion progresses, we can have much detailed thoughts on this. Is number meet between AI solutions and the real users of those solutions, particularly for the social sector. Because be it healthcare, education, or anything, we have realized, and we did a small survey in the beginning of this year, where we found that not many organizations, especially those who are at the grassroots level, are equipped enough or are even market ready for these solutions to be implemented. And that creates a much divide than, of course, the access and the tech solution part of it. Second component that we try to look at it is from the resource lens, that from how are we looking at the resource from the scalability perspective when it comes to quality of data and the policy enabled things like how data can be an enabler for evidence-based policies. In Indian ecosystem, as we all know, that this is a big gap, and how private sector can play a role in that, in addition to the 2% CSR agenda. So those were the few triggers to come up with this exercise, and Athan and the entire team played a big role. So in the beginning of this year, we did this exercise, and of course, Professor Jasjeet was also one of the guardians and guides for this entire thing. There was a forum which was mainly to reflect on and collect data from. And here we are in a way concluding. So, with the insights from each one of you who are sectoral experts in your own way. So that's the context I wanted to put in here, Raghu, and over to you for the progress ahead. Yeah.
Thank you, Akanksha. Now let me turn to Subhashish. Subhashish, if you could introduce yourself briefly while also touching on, data and AI relevant work.
Thank you, Raghu. As you mentioned, I work with Omega Network India. We are an investment firm that supports and funds bold entrepreneurs who help create a meaningful life for every Indian. These entrepreneurs could be the non-profit or for-profit sector. We are currently deploying about $50 to $55 million in India every year across 6 different areas, ranging from education and financial inclusion to property rights and governance and citizen engagement. For us, AI is not necessarily one of our verticals, as I'm sure many of us would agree. It's only a tool which therefore permeates many of these 6 areas that we work in. However, one of the lenses that we do pick up and focus a lot on as far as AI is concerned is responsible use of data and AI. So that's been a cut-in point. With that in mind, we've certainly funded a lot of research and increasingly innovations around data protection, around meaningful and ethical uses of data. How do you make consent more meaningful? How do you make processing safer? How do you make the infrastructure that carries data more robust, etc.? From at a very AI lens, we had at one point, I think 2 years back, funded Tandem Research to bring out a report on use cases of AI in different sectors. And currently with the Digital Futures Lab, we have a 2-year program on responsible AI, where there's going to be a lot of research that they're going to be doing both an ethical at a kind of conceptual and a practical level on responsible uses of AI. So while I'm sure that a lot of the equity investments we make, probably most of those companies use AI in one form or the other, but the one that we get more engaged on is around responsible uses of AI.
Thank you, Subhashish. Appreciate that. Dolly, over to you to introduce yourself and your work a little bit, please.
Thank you, Raghu. Hi, everyone. A very good afternoon. I'm really glad to be part of this panel. And I am a computer science graduate and studying artificial intelligence from National University of Singapore. I have been leading Pratham's efforts in AI-based projects since the last 3 years. Pratham, as you all know, is one of the largest not-for-profits working to provide quality education in rural parts of India. So talking about Pratham, whenever we try to work on any solution, we make sure the solution is innovative, it's low cost and replicable so that it can be scaled. And the other aspect we look at that the solution should be very simple. So these core values were also taken care of when we started thinking about how we can use AI in our work, how it can help and optimize the programs and processes that we have. So one of the out of all various different projects, one of the core agenda is to that we focused on was assessments. So assessments, which is a key component in teaching and learning experience. Oral reading assessments like ASER has been there for many years. It has been done across various countries. And the tool is simple enough so that it can be done outside the classroom, even by the parents, by the teachers, and the community. So how do we, so the problem at hand was how do we use AI to optimize the process of conducting the test so that we can identify students with reading difficulty. So that was the problem at hand. That was the overall problem, but the off-the-shelf AI solutions that's already there is not easily, it's not like a plug and play. We could use it in our use case because there are many other factors that needs to be taken care of when we are working on solutions, especially for rural children. Limited internet connection, then the digital divide, and the solutions that we need are to be in regional Indian languages, but most of the state-of-the-art models are for English. So these were some of the challenges that we faced while working on the assessment-based problems. And one core value that we focused on while working on this solution was to build our own data set. And for that, we were very open for corporate volunteering. So there were people who were ready to annotate our work, to do the transcription for us. We were very fortunate enough to be working with industry experts on doing research around the data that we generate and from getting help from the academia on the direction of how to frame it into a AI-based problem that can be solved. And yeah, so that was the overall of how we thought about using AI in our work. But with that being said, I would also like to highlight at Pratham, we always keep education first and technology second. So the core idea is that we try to understand the context, we try to identify the gap, and then use technology to help fill the gap so that learning is maximized for children and satisfying for the overall community. Yeah, that's why we try to. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Dolly. So, with actually you set us up well for really my first question, right? And that question was going to be actually give us some very specific examples. The reason that's important is the lot of public conversation around AI kind of lurches between either hype, AI is doing all these wonderful things, self-driving cars and all that, versus fear, right? Hype versus fear being, AI is taking away our jobs, right? But what is the reality of AI and data in social sector today? And before I even jump in and ask a broader question, and I'll kind of tell you, the question I'm going to go to next is, what sort of use cases or problems really are good fit for us to think about solving them using AI, right? That really is the first question, right? But towards that, maybe you can use some examples and bring out some generalize from that regarding how should we look for problems that are amenable to AI and problems that we should actually try to apply AI. One thing that I'll clarify is I'm going to use a very loose definition of AI, not just machine learning or deep learning, even maybe rules-based automation. For this discussion, I would take it as AI, right? So with that, let me kick off perhaps Gaurav, you touched on a few areas, right? You have touched on a few areas of work, uh, uh, speech synthesis, Earth observatory, and things like that. So perhaps you can get us started with some use cases and some criteria you would look for.
Yeah, thank you, Raghu. I think there are these. I think I take it from where Dolly left out. You know, for India, agriculture is a prime area, and we have been in talks with again, you know, so we in India, GIZ has a bigger portfolio on natural resource management and biodiversity, right? So we are trying to look at areas where AI could be sort of what you call, it can accentuate what is already happening. So for example, if we are utilizing GIS mapping for, you know, this is geo information systems mapping of, say, pond areas or all the irrigation sort of outlets in a pan state wide, you know, area, then how you augment that data sets on top of it, ground reality data sets. That means somebody has a device, it actually tells you, he goes to the scene and sees, oh, this pond is there, the depth is this much, the water before monsoon and after monsoon is this, and I mark it correctly, right? Again, vector marking is quite difficult and needs to be very accurate. But if you have this type of a data set collected, then you can actually you do some sort of future planning. And we say that, you know, maybe you could utilize some foresight intelligence in telling people that, okay, maybe there is, you know, be cautious that maybe the monsoons will fail. So the water reduction would be here, or we should make some catch up areas here or there, or whatever. This is very fundamental examples that we are currently trying to look at from a you know, big project within India with GIZ called Water Security and for Sustainable Development. Another, I mean, again, fundamentally, when it comes to agriculture value chains, you can utilize sort of starting from when to sow the seeds, you know, how to water, you know, the agriculture practices, all the way till post harvesting and selling. So it depends, you know. So Telangana government, we are trying to work with a problem statement for them. So Telangana is a very typical problem. Initially, it was to be a dry land state with less water. Now they have built excellent canals, and farmers have become intelligent and now only producing rice. And it has for last 3 years become the, you know, rice bucket of India in terms of South India, wherever you call it. So crop diversification is one of the challenges that the government is facing. Now this is very simple looking at it, but again, crop diversification can be filtered down to multiple levels. What exactly are you looking at? Are you trying to map how much wheat should be produced in what area and how, you know, or you want how the crops should be actually laid out so that the proper utilization of water can take place? I'm talking about very simple questions which might take some time to, you know, get, but the Telangana government we are working with, because they have this open data portal concept, and they have currently done some sort of a pre-assessment in last 2-3 years with some of their own initiatives, and we want to add on to them that, okay, we can pick up one of the challenges and then act upon it. So I rested at that, but I'm just saying that earth observation and speech, I'll just give you 2 comments, is like we are looking at low resource languages. We are working on a very small project of collecting data on Mundari language. Now Mundari is spoken up by a large tribal area in Orissa, you know, Jharkhand, in and around Andhra Pradesh, also like 2.3 million, 3 million people. But there is less text. There are no resources in terms of both radio, news, newspaper, or even books. You know, very limited. So what we're trying to do is create a small text-based data set, and then see if they can be utilized in areas where Dolly was saying, education, giving primary scientific and mathematic education to people who don't understand the language. To even to collect this data, nobody's putting efforts, because it is, I mean, first, who wants to learn Mundari? And second is, what do you do the utility with it? But there is a larger notion of losing these low resource languages in India, which are huge. I mean, I'm just giving you a moderate example. There are thousands and thousands of them. Yeah. So I'll rest it at that. Thank you.
Got it. Thank you, Gaurav. Actually, let me, Akanksha had earlier mentioned that Professor Jasjeet Singh was actually helping you think about this strategy, etc. So maybe it will be useful to ask Jasjeet, what are some piece of advice you have when folks say, hey, what problems should we solve with AI or data, right? And are there broad principles that we could, draw on? Akanksha, I'll come to you right after that.
Thank you, Raghu. So obviously, I think data is a much bigger space in a way than we typically talk about AI. So it's worth separating the two. I would say every organization needs to be data-driven, right? And what I mean by that is, you have to ultimately measure progress, right? Or measure how things are working. Or even when you're doing needs analysis, you need to do measurement. Dolly talked about the ACER survey that Pratham does, right? All of that involves data. So, and data are obviously being applied at a much bigger scale increasingly. Now, sometimes people take the AI machine learning in particular approaches. Sometimes they're using more traditional statistical approaches like I mentioned. But loosely, the way I think of this is, when we are trying to mimic a human approach of sort of detecting patterns in data from past data and then saying, now you give me a new set of data and I'm going to make predictions in that data based on what I learned from looking at previous data. I think those kind of applications are most natural. And the typical example that's given in the first session in any AI courses, detecting images like cats, right? So how do you know whether it's a cat or a dog? Well, the way you train an AI algorithm is you give it thousands of pictures of cats of all forms and colors in all different settings, in all different climate conditions and all of that. And the important thing is you don't know exactly why. You're not necessarily able to explain how it's able to detect a cat, right? But because it has seen millions and maybe thousands of pictures in the past, now if you feed it another 1,000, the hope is that it will be in most of the cases be able to tell the difference between a cat and a dog. And this might seem like a silly example, but then this directly sort of carries forward in context in which, for example, in the social sector, if you're trying to say, I'm running a training program with, at-risk youth in low-income rural areas, which of them is going to drop out of my program, is at risk of dropping out, and what can I do to keep them, right? So that kind of question, when you're predicting, narrowing down sort of at-risk population, whether it's at-risk population of somebody, for example, dropping out of your program, or of somebody quitting your organization, but doing it in a way that is not Y is driven by X and Z, but doing it in terms of looking at in the past who dropped out or who sort of was at risk, and using that as a mechanism without necessarily knowing the exact relationships, but you're just making prediction that's useful for you without being able to explain, right? And so let me just quickly just comment on one aspect that this goes. Typically, if you're looking for traditional statistical or hypothesis testing kind of approach, then you want to have a very concrete model of X leads to Y leads to Z. But and therefore, when explainability is very important, that's where AI, particularly deep learning, becomes a bit tricky, right? So if you just say, person X was granted a credit by, a financial inclusion organization, but person Y was not, and you're worried that is there discrimination based on gender, based on race, based on religion, and so on, it's very tricky to establish that in the AI context. So at a minimum, you'll have to think very hard about it when designing the algorithms, versus if you were just doing it in the old-fashioned way of, okay, if somebody has said, they're unhappy in the previous performance review, they're likely to drop out of the company kind of thing. So I'll pause there. I mean, I could go on with a lot of examples, but let's hear more from the others. Thanks.
Sure. Over to you, Akanksha. And as you share any examples, one thing that it would be great for you to touch on is something you said about really scalability of solutions, etc. Right? And at Vadhani AI, I remember as we launched various things, that would often be place where things would break down, not necessarily because that AI cannot be done, not necessarily because that we couldn't get started. But when we looked at that path to scale, things well beyond AI, could be supply chains, could be funding mechanisms, could be just uniformity of operating models. Any of those reasons, any of those things could cause basically lack of scalability, right? And then we would basically say, no, well, this AI is not worth doing, not because AI can't be done, because scalability doesn't exist. So we'd love to hear your reflections on these sorts of challenges, and of course, any specific examples you can provide would help.
So you talked about challenges, Raghu, and I may like to bring in a perspective with a broader lens of problem and solutions. And of course, having said that, infrastructure remains like a permanent thing that we all need to deal with before we talk about all of these fancy stuff of data and AI solutions. But like Professor Jasjeet mentioned, that I couldn't agree more that data is a much wider space, because it's not just about data, but also the quality of data. And we badly lack quality data frameworks. And it is not just in one aspect, but if you talk about health education. So quality of data is one thing, and then it is also about exclusivity of data. So we are dealing with data at various touch points where we do not have a common pool with reliable information access. And that is, I feel, the major solution, because of course, the digital education and the digital divide exists, but then how do we translate, all of these solutions at the last mile and put it into work with reliable information is the major challenge that we have seen. We were trying to experiment a project on telemedicine here during the COVID times, and it was a hybrid model with an organization. They were trying to have some specialized services offerings on telemedicine along with the physical presence of a doctor. And we realized that it is such a simple thing that we can have a state level or a district level common data pool for services like healthcare, even education. We have experimented with some products. But the exclusivity remains a very big problem. And also at the data collection front, I would like to really highlight that not, training and all of this. So it doesn't seem to go away tomorrow or in next few years, because, the juncture where we are at is also, we are struggling with many things at the same time and trying to avoid the ocean when we talk about enabling AI and technology to solve the last mile problems. So we realize that, one of the major challenges is the partnership of the public and the private sector, because the government there can play a huge role in creating a mainstream framework, bringing everybody together under the same roof. And, it's not something that, one organization or two organizations can do. And that is why one of the important roles that, we wanted to put together through this paper. But happy to hear from others and get their feedback as well.
Great. Thanks, Akanksha. Let me turn to Subhashish here. Subhashish, you talked about responsible AI. How would you, if I'm doing an assessment of whether or not I'm going to address certain problem using AI or try to build an AI-based solution, I don't think there are AI solutions, right? AI can be part of some solution. How should we use criteria around responsible AI in deciding whether or not this is something we should do or not?
I mean,
and again, feel free to use examples to for illustration.
There are two ways to answer this question. One is, should I do AI or not? And if I decide to do AI, how should I do AI, right? And those are two aspects of responsible AI. Let me firstly deal with the second one because it's slightly more straightforward. At least I would think of responsible AI falling within three buckets, because at the end of the day, because data is the fuel that feeds the AI engine, I think there's a lot of ethical questions around the collection and use of data. I think there is, of course, plenty of work and knowledge out there on data protection, but questions like, how are you collecting this data? The person you're collecting this data from, are they aware that you're collecting this data? Of course, this is relevant in situations of personal data. Do they have the ability to kind of withdraw their consent? Do they have the ability to access that data? Do they have the ability to verify, rectify that data, etc.? So I think that's one pillar of responsible AI that one would look at. The second pillar of responsible AI that folks should look at is how do you bridge the information asymmetries? Because of course the question being, hey, are these all kind of black box algorithms, and can something be done to improve their transparency so that they will fit within a wider social construct of good governance? And to that extent, I think there have been proposals, of course, none of them at this point necessarily mainstream or compelling, around can you open these up for a set of professional auditors who kind of come in and audit it, or are there ways to kind of make the input output somewhat more transparent so that people can figure out what's going on in this black box. The third, and I think honestly most important of all of these, especially in a context like India with low literacy and probably not the best grievance redressal systems in sector after sector, is how do you set up some sort of grievance redressal mechanism? Because if very consequential decisions are going to be made based on these AI algorithms, then I think people do need to have the opportunity to contest them and be find recourse in a time-bound manner. Otherwise, in a country like India, what often happens is in percentage terms, people might these cases might be small, but in absolute terms, they certainly do add up to a lot. So I think those are kind of the use case. How do you do AI responsibly? Now the question is, in what cases does the use of AI make sense? Again, it's a wider question. I think people will bring in their own kind of sectoral lenses to this, and the answer will depend on each sector. The sector I'm most familiar with, which is data protection, we probably don't talk about AI and data protection as much, but I think the use cases, especially in a context like India, are really, really important, because especially if you look at financial services or any other services you are providing to bottom of the pyramid customers, you do want to be able to both keep them safe as well as make sure that the funnel is wider open so that people can actually get in the system. And I think these kind of high frequency transactions are a very ripe case for uses of AI. So just to give you an example, identity and access management, which is if I have a bank account, how do I know that I'm the one getting into that bank account? Are there use cases of AI around that? Yes, we've seen several entrepreneurs, startups, etc., try to address that problem based on a bunch of data analytics, etc., that they are able to collect. Similarly, if one looks at even say data being breached on the dark web and stuff like that, we are seeing interesting applications of AI, because otherwise any of these businesses would be flooded with false negative and false positive. So how are you going to use AI to kind of minimize that set that companies are grappling with? So I think any kind of, at least in the data protection space, any kind of regular high frequency operations that you are running, and especially ones where you are trying to create this balance between safety as well as kind of inclusion or efficiency, I think lend themselves very naturally to some sort of AI-based solutions.
Thanks, Subhashish. Dolly, over to you. Actually, I would love for you to dig a little bit into the assessment use case you talked about, and actually talk about the challenges of actually making it happen, right? And if there was a process through which you decided that's the use case to work on, that would actually be wonderful to hear.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, while deciding on which part of where do we use AI, it's very important to think about why do we need AI in the first place. Is there anything that AI can do to help optimize the existing process, or will it add some extra burden on or overheads on the existing process? So it's very important to think about those perspectives before deciding on using AI in the solutions. So in our case, assessments was a primary focus, because children are not at the grade level they are supposed to be in schools. As per ASSER 2018, 1 out of 4 children are leaving a grade 8 without even acquiring basic reading skills. So this is having an automated system where we can identify children who are struggling, and helping them at the right time can be quite impactful, especially for the children at the grade level of 3 to 5. So like Jasjeet mentioned, it's important to identify at the right time before they fail in their examinations or worse, dropping out. So those are a few considerations that were there when deciding on to work on this particular problem statement. Regarding the challenges, yeah, there were quite a number of challenges when we started working on this problem statement. The first and foremost challenge was that of the data set. Like Gaurav mentioned, the data sets that they're publicly available, firstly, they are mostly in English or European languages. There are a very few data sets that they're for regional Indian languages. That's the first challenge. Second challenge, even when we have the data sets are mostly for adults. We don't have data sets for children. And there is a difference between the pronunciation, the accent, and the intonation of children's speech, which cannot be compared to adult speech. So it's important to take into consideration domain adaptation and other aspects when we are thinking about solutions on that perspective. And then the third case is, again, the data sets are for speech recognition, not for speech evaluation. So again, that becomes like our problem statement is oral reading assessment. So it's for assessment, not recognition. So there is a difference between speech recognition and assessment. The solutions, the data sets that can be used for speech recognition cannot be used directly for speech evaluation. The reading proficiencies of children are different. They read in different ways. Their fluency, their pronunciation, all those are different. So we need representative data sets that can be used, and the problem statements should be formulated as evaluation instead of assessment. So these are the few considerations while working on the oral reading assessment. Another project that we worked on in the assessment domain is the free text answer assessment. So that's the assessment of descriptive answers to open-ended questions. So there are students in upper primary, and Pratham helps the dropout students to reappear for examinations. But they need a platform where they can practice giving tests anytime they want to. And the challenge, again, always in India especially, is that the teacher to student ratio is more than 30. So it's not possible to keep evaluating and understanding the learning needs of individual students. So such kind of automated system helps there. And again, here the major challenge was, where is the data set? We don't have data sets for education domain that can be used directly. And that's when we decided on having our own data set, building our data set, given the scale that we work with. We have assessment apps in place and can help collect the data set that is actually relevant to our work and work on solutions around that. Yeah.
Got it. Thank you, Dolly. I'm going to do the next round all around data, but before I go there, something that struck me was maybe I can share a little bit about actually using criteria for choosing what problems are worth addressing using AI or not. And I'll quickly share a framework. We used to call this the 7-question framework that I and Rahul Panikkar developed at Padwani AI. Now I call it 9-question framework because I have introduced 2 more questions in it. Very briefly, those questions are: what is the specific problem that I'm trying to solve that will have big impact, right? Is that problem actually amenable to AI, right? Is AI actually possible? Does the AI approach have a substantial jump over other approaches that may be lower resource consuming, right? Fourth is, even after I do the AI, are there other problems that basically, compromise the impact that I'm going to have? I'll use an example there. Sputum microscopy. You could do beautiful AI to count the bacterium in a sputum slide, but collection of the sample of the sputum itself is a challenge that AI will not solve, right? Then the next 3 were more about feasibility. Data is a big element of it. Do we have the data or have the wherewithal with our partner network to build the data to really overcome the cold start problem, right? Cold start problem really is endemic in this space, right? Whenever you think of AI. Do I have co-creation partners from the domain, right? Do I have scaling partners and pathways, right? And lastly, have I really understood the risk profile well enough to know that when I launch the AI solution, I've not thought through what secondary effects or primary, leave alone primary effects, what secondary effects I might have. An example there, we're developing AI for better targeting health resources to avoid patients dropping off from tuberculosis treatment. When you better target that, that means that resource is not going elsewhere, right? Someone else who otherwise might have gotten that, that healthcare worker attention is not going to get that attention. Is that ethical? Is that responsible? These are the questions one should grapple with. So yeah, sorry, I quickly rattled off a 9-question framework there. Happy to elaborate separately outside of this, but I thought it's important to share some frameworks that kind of do exist. With that, let me kind of jump in and really ask the question of data. And Gaurav, I'll come to you because I was very fascinated by the fact that you're taking a good long view approach, realizing that without data, you actually cannot build some of these solutions one imagines. And you seem to be embarking on initiatives that actually first bring useful data together.
Yes, I think Raghu, I mean, taking from your example itself, vadvaniai.org in India is creating a lot of data sets on, say, one simple application on cotton crop, right? So we are actually finalizing maybe today or tomorrow a grant agreement to just open up these data sets onto GitHub, and onto a good space. I mean, and also not only the data, but also the AI model that you have developed. I mean, it's a fundamental fact that knowledge is sharing, but people don't share because they think data is proprietary, specifically because they're working on a very narrow sort of a stream of thought in the private space. And I'm not talking about only this. I can talk to Google.com for decades, but they will still not open up their language data set, which we are, and I have given them free space to use my data set, which I will collect for Mundari language, right? It's a very fundamental cause. So, but I can talk to google.org, which is financing a lot of India-specific social impact projects. But are they really financing the true sense of, creating a data set of 100,000 data points for our language? No. So there is a fundamental difference of how these organizations are also approaching this. So keeping on to the data, I think the question is also on the data governance side in India. Till the time the law itself takes cognizance of data protection and privacy in India comes to life, there's a lot of confusion in terms of how data fiduciaries will work, who will own it, how do I get consent mechanisms in place, how do I really make things happen, So I think the governance aspect has to go hand in hand. And I have, also said this, that let's try and fail in data governance. Let's see what goes through in one sector. In agriculture, it might really not go in healthcare, which has a lot of private, individual data sets. What might work in forestry and natural resource management might be different in disaster management or flood prevention and all. So it has to be a data governance model which is very sector specific, and the state can prioritize, provincial levels, that they want to do something on this regard, right? Every state is not trying to do everything together. So I think there is a hand-in-hand requirement for data governance and data quality and everything to let's see, test what we can do. And I'm sure there would be transparency problem, bias problem. We are a very diverse country. You pick up any population, we will have, there is so much bias in the dialects that we are encompassing as of now. It's huge. But we can't really help it. But what are we trying to achieve? Are we trying to achieve a simple primary education portfolio, as Dolly was saying, for children who can't read and write, or even if they are in first grade, they can't write their names? Can this really help? If yes, then we should go ahead, irrespective of how things are going. I mean, there's a larger debate. I would like to focus on. I don't know whether it's a how good data sharing in India, but even in the technical institutes, IITs. People want to share. They don't know what will happen if they share. It's a fundamental flaw because we don't have a legislation around it, right? And these are the people who are creating these fabulous applications, but they have 50 hours of data on language. I'm still on the language front. What would they do with it, right? So where do they share it? Who owns it? So I keep it at that. Yeah. Thanks.
Got it. Thanks, Gaurav. Subhashish, again, you have a bit of a view of the landscape of various initiatives, etc. So it would be useful to hear from you challenges around bringing data together, especially if possible, if you have any experience in this data as a public good.
Yeah, I think won't say I have the granularity of someone who's kind of been very close to the implementation front, right? But as an organization that had for many years of the past of the previous decade worked a lot on open data. I think we and having also invested in a company in the UK called DigiMe, which was essentially going to or intends to be a kind of data marketplace, which is ingesting data and then making it accessible for people who want to kind of use that to run analysis, algorithms, AI, etc. I think the biggest problem we saw was a couple of things, right? Firstly, just the availability of data. So even in Europe with GDPR, data portability and all of that, I think just for organizations to set up systems for people to kind of move around their data was something that we found was fairly limited. Secondly, even when they did that, just the taxonomy of data and was a big problem. So even now, for example, we fund parts of a project at Niti Aayog called ENDAP, and just the heaviest lift there is actually standardizing some of the markers, both spatial and intertemporal, around just districts getting split and combining and changing names and all of that and spelt differently. And these are kind of one might almost think are the trivial parts of the problem, and a lot of the more complex ones are the ones that Gaurav.
Totally. 10 ways to probably spell Shanti, right?
Yeah. Right. So those kind of pragmatic difficulties in making that happen. And thirdly, and again, I mean, I think the rest of the panelists can probably educate me a lot more on this, but I think at least in the open data movement, the problem we found generally was, even when you make it available, just the uptake of some of this, right? Because I suppose it has to be of a certain amount of fidelity for all of these to be used, and the amount of effort and kind of coordination it takes in getting to that level of fidelity itself, it's very difficult for any one or even a handful of organizations to move. So I think at that level of kind of the input, the taxonomy and the cleaning up in the middle, as well as the usage, I think we found a number of problems. So at least the way we guys have started kind of working on it is trying to address the kind of middleware of all of this, which is some of these taxonomies, etc. And that is one way in which we're trying to do that, but we know there are lots of other conversations and we're kind of trying to get engaged in those.
Great. Akanksha, anything you'd like to add on the challenges of data and what you're looking to do in that space?
So when we talk about data for public good, I think, like others said, and I couldn't agree more to it, that we individual organizations can only continue to look at data capital. But I think there comes a big role of the policy interface that we all need for creating, say, open source data software and, open data sets, which could be used, say, for immediate use. And I think there would immediately come the role of translators, as I said in the beginning, which could translate tech solutions for, implementers at the grassroots. And so, one of the things and takeaways from this entire exercise we would like to put forward further is how academia, government, and private sector can come together and bridge this role for creating quality data frameworks, and then build onto it further, at the policy level. So this is what I think everybody agreed onto this, and I would like to hear more thoughts from Professor Jasjeet and others.
Yeah, Jasjeet, what would your suggestions be in trying to create data for public good as assets? I know it's a very big problem.
Yeah.
If you want to take that on, do take that on, or generally, I mean, the theme is how do we bring together useful data, right,
So I'm going to cheat a little because that's a tough problem. So I'm going to change the question a little bit since you gave me the option. And I would say it's indeed a huge problem that very often we don't have data. But something to be aware of, and here I'm bringing in a little bit of from what I've read globally, that even when there's data, there can be new kinds of problems that come up on what is that data, right? And these overlap somewhat with some of the things that other panelists have raised, right? So for example, in the US context, a couple of applications of data have been, one of the things is called predictive policing, which is because there's data available on who has committed crime in the past, you see a new person with a new profile, and you give them a likelihood of, will crime happen? Or more specific, there's two parts to it. One is, will crime happen in this geography, this zip code, right? And what has happened there is, not surprisingly, a lot of these locations have ended up being predominantly Black locations because of the historical incidents of crime. But what happens is, if the police thinks that's where the crime will happen, that's where the police will patrol more. So they're more likely to catch even trivial crime. So they'll patrol it even more. So they'll arrest even more Blacks. And then back in the databases, you'll get data that is even more biased against the Blacks, right? And the point here, and just to give another example from a very different context, and I think this was Amazon, which is where it had happened, that they had tried to automate their recruiting to some extent. And what they found was, they said, okay, in Amazon, we are finding that, okay, we want to recruit people that are more likely to succeed in Amazon. So the training data is who has succeeded in the past. And based on that, they set up an algorithm which basically reduced the likelihood of a woman being hired. Why? Because on average, women were less successful at Amazon. But the problem was not with the women, right? The problem was with the social structure and processes that are embedded in the process. So it's a little bit of garbage in, garbage out, and things can even get magnified. So I mean, I just want to make sure that that part is highlighted, which is even if you have data. And by the way, this is not just about, let's drop the nobody can use the gender field or nobody can use the race field, because other variables are correlated with that, and you would still be able to infer somebody's gender or race from other fields, even if you, this is I think using data in a half-hearted way is almost more dangerous than not using. And I want to make sure that this aspect is highlighted a little bit, even though I had absolutely nothing to do with the question you asked.
Thank you, Jasjeet. I know Gaurav has his hands up. We have 2 minutes. At the same time, I want to give Dolly a final word on anything she wants to share about, I mean, as a practitioner, right, regarding bringing to the data. Dolly, and then to Gaurav.
Yeah. So like Gaurav mentioned, it's important to open source the data that we collect. That's what we at Pratham has also done. We collected a data set of 5,000 children reading out a text in Hindi and Marathi, and that we open source. We published it on the ICAST conference so that other researchers can get the advantage of working on learning apps for children. So on that, we also succeeded in getting a funding to collect more the audio clips of 70,000 children reading out various levels of text. And even we are planning to open source that data as well. This is to enable researchers. We as a organization, we need support from researchers to build solutions that can be really helpful. And it is important because the solutions that's there as of now is not fit for our application. And since there is no data, it becomes very difficult. How do we work on those kind of solutions? So if we are in the capacity to build such data sets, we should open source such kind of data sets so that the experts, researchers working around these problem statements, they can get benefit from there and can work on solutions required. Yeah.
Got it. Gaurav, over to you.
Just 36. I think I like the idea of where Jasjeet was actually hinting at. But I think there is again this parallel track. There is, you just don't create an AI model, or you just don't try to sort of, create these data sets, they are very incremental steps in creation of data sets. So I think from the onset, there has to be this hand holding between technologists, domain experts, I don't know, linguists, everybody to work in that sort of a structure. And we don't have those SOPs, to really create these. So we have a software development lifecycle, but we don't have an AI development lifecycle. I mean, keeping it very simple. If we have something which can parallelly go, it will work towards a particular solution. I'm not saying it will work for a sector or a domain. It will work towards a particular solution in minimizing transparency and bias, not eliminate it, but minimizing it.